I'm Paul Dickson, president of the Hill Farm Historical Society, and we're here at the farm in North Oaks, Minnesota. The three buildings that remain here are all that remain of the original active farm area of Jim Hill's farm. Hill bought this land in 1883, and he grew the farm to about 5,300 acres by the time of his death in 1918. It continued to operate as a farm for another 20 years or so, and then it was transitioned into the community of North Oaks in the early 1950s. Historical Society has existed since 1989. It was formed in order to preserve these buildings, this land, clean it up, and turn it into the park-like setting that it is today. And now it's more on telling the story of the farm, its role in the development of Mr. Hill's Great Northern Railroad, and into farming practices in general in the state of Minnesota and along the Great Northern to the Pacific Ocean. The building we're in is the dairy building. Hill had a number of buildings. We'll see that in the last step of this tour in this particular area. The dairy building was essentially a creamery. His people milked about 140 head of cattle, and they made butter here. That was sold in the city of St. Paul in a number of stores. So the whole process started in this room where just south of here was a milking barn, and they had an elevated platform that came into this room, and the people moved it in, poured it into the funnels and onto that scale so they could keep track of their daily production. Once in here, it was cooled and moved across to the next room. Interesting point is they milk various kinds of cattle here, even cattle that we consider beef cattle. The next step was really to process the milk, separate it through a separator. That's a centrifugal device. Basically pushes the butter fat out of the milk. You get in one side, you get butter fat, you get cream, and the other side you get skimmed milk. So once that's done, it's cooled, and there's a cooling room here where it's chilled down to the proper temperature. Then it's churned. They had a machine called a butter cutter. So they put about 90 pounds of butter in that little box, work this lever, and it would cut 1 pound blocks, which would be wrapped. And that's an example of the product that they sold in the stores in St. Paul. And these are just an example of, a lot of times on the farm, if they were going to put butter on a table for a special occasion, they'd use these butter making forms and create cute little icons, we'd call them now, or cute little designs on the top of the butter. These are just some old churns. We're not necessarily, we don't know exactly used on this farm, but they're examples of this churn technology of the late 1800s and early 19s. This being the most primitive of plunge churn, which was a crock thing with a plunger in it. This is a butterfat tester, a Babcock tester. Has local ties. It was invented at the University of Wisconsin when a guy figured out how to separate butterfat from milk so he could actually tell which cow was producing, which amounts of butterfat, which was very important then because the butterfat was more important than the milk itself. The area between this wall and that wall is about 5.5, 6 feet. And it spans from the door here back to this wall, this corner. And that was the ice chamber. And there was the ice in there, the cold air would flow out of these registers into these rooms, and any warm air that accumulated would go out vents in these ceilings. They harvested their own ice here from Pleasant Lake, drug it up here to the ice house, which sat just to the north of this building, and then replenished the ice in the ice room as it melted. We're in a granary, and a granary is a place where they store and process grain for cattle feed and hog feed and sheep feed or whatever else you want to feed. So the instruments in here date back to the late 1880s and very early 1900s. This room contains artifacts of the day. This was what we consider now a silage machine. They called it a fodder chopper. Now you have silage machines driving through the field and chopping silage and spitting it into a wagon or a truck. Back then they had to bring the corn in, throw it in this belt-driven machine, hand-fed, and then shovel the silage out of the bottom. So this is one of the oldest machines we have, because you can see it's all wooden construction with the exception of the iron pieces where necessary. It even has a wooden flywheel. This is a corn sheller. So this was to make silage, which is a great dairy food. This is to shell corn, which you would crack, grind, and then feed to various animals. And this is a two-hole sheller. They would simply shovel the corn into this feeder, and it would come through, and the kernels get knocked off by this big knobby wheel. It's quite a process. The corn would come out of the bottom, and cobs get expelled off the end, and then you'd be ready to do something else with it. This is a seed sorter. Back in those days, there weren't any Pioneer, DeKalb, or other big seed providers. So farmers had to preserve part of this year's crop for next year's seed. This was designed to do that for corn, selecting the prime kernels so that it fed through the planter well. Just like with that seed sorter, you had to save grain for the next year. And this is a fanning mill, so this serves a similar purpose to that, except it was for wheat, barley, rye, etc. So a belt would drive this thing, and it would feed the grain through, and it would be sorted and cleaned to the best of this machine's ability so that it could be sacked, bagged, and put away for next year's crop. This is an example of a bagging elevator. It was left here again. It was most likely used in concert with that corn sheller. If it fell on the ground as it's currently configured, you had to shovel it up. You just simply feed this under that machine, so all the corn would come up here and be easily bagged. These are the large churns that were used down. These actually were used right here on the farm, down by the dairy building, the creamery. So it's like 150 and 350 or 400 gallons. They normally fill these things about half full, run them for a few hours, probably 1 to 1.5 hours until the butter was firming up, and then remove the butter. We're in a machine shop. This building has two halves. This is a machine shop, blacksmith shop's on the other side of that wall. You can see this big pulley system here, pulley and belt system. It drove an underground shaft, which was down this pit, and out to a couple of the outbuildings that actually drove the machines that we just saw up in the granary, like the grain mill, corn sheller, etc. The thing behind you is a model of the farm as it existed, at least the model of the farm where the buildings are. So around this identifies each of the structures that was in this area at the time, at 1884, 1890 time frame. There were horse barns, cattle barns, sheep barns, milking barns, riding horse barns, workhorse barns, etc. It was pretty elaborate. Our area that was given to the Hill Farm Historical Society is basically about there, out to about here, over to here, and then back down here. There's about 350 feet of Pleasant Lake Lakeshore, which is really prime real estate, and we were really fortunate to get this property. As I said, up in the granary, we spent a lot of money on it, but to have it been lost would have been a tragedy. There was always an active blacksmith here. A blacksmith was a mechanic in those days. I mean, we call them blacksmiths, but they were the mechanics of the days. When they transitioned from the horse and buggy to the automobile, they became the first automobile mechanics too. So they took the blacksmith, and if you specialized enough, the wheelwright, he specialized in wheels, they had a very important space on the farm. A lot of wagons, a lot of wheels to maintain. They weren't inherently reliable. This is what a wheel looked like, typically on a wagon or a carriage. It had a spindle made of a very hard wood, as well as the spokes. And these things are called fellies. It's essentially the body of the wheel over which you put a steel tire like this, and that provides the durability for the wheel. So they would, you make one out of new material, the new material dry out, they would get loose on the tire, They had machines for stretching and shrinking that steel. That's what this was. The blacksmith would heat it, and they either expand it or contract it and reinstall it on the wheel. And this just shows some of those conventional practices. In the old days, they used to have to heat these in a fire, expand the steel, put it on the wheel, and then cool it with a big bucket of water very quickly, or the thing would burn up to shrink it back on the wheel.